Welcome everybody this evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and supporters of the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture. I would hereby like to welcome you to the lecture by Dr. Elisabeth Suzanne Kassab on Tuesday, today, at the Käte Hamburger Center aforementioned. Her lecture is entitled Arab Thought and Arab Revolts, Arab Intellectuals as Legislators in Transformative Times. Elisabeth Kassab is especially prepared to do this difficult task of bringing together intellectual history and political change in the Arab world. You studied, if I may say so, I remember well a moment when Pierre Bourdieu was presented, and he was talked about in the third person, and he said, no, I'm not dead, I'm very much alive, so that's why I'm a little bit changing. You studied philosophy at the American University of Beirut and the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, where you obtained a doctorate degree with a thesis on the theory of social action in the Schutz-Parsons debate. A most delicate and in the same time fundamental debate in the intellectual discussion between, on the one side, sociological idealism, where Parsons is putting Alfred Schutz, if rightly or not, you have to reread, one has to reread your book. The most likable sociologist who ever lived in the discipline, and Talcott Parsons himself, perhaps not so likable, the self-proclaimed theorist of a voluntaristic theory of social action, an incurable theorist, as he called himself. She was subsequently postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bielefeld. Now there comes a long list of very impressive locations and spaces. Before teaching first at the American University of Beirut and then at the University of Balamand in 1999, Dr. Kassab received a Fulbright scholarship at the New School at New York. She was then visiting scholar at Columbia University before researching at the Yale Center for International and Area Studies as visiting associated professor from 2006 to 2007 and holding a post as a capita visiting professor at the Middle East Institute of Columbia University in 2008. From 2008 to 2009, Dr. Kassab was further research fellow at the Orient Institute in Beirut, which forms part of the Max Weber Foundation, recently founded, only resembling all the Geisteswissenschaftliche Institute from Germany. In 2010, she was guest researcher at the Department for West Asian History at the University of Erfurt's Faculty of History, before moving on to the Berlin Graduate School Muslim Cultures and Societies at the Freie Universität in 2011. In the spring of 2012, you were visiting professor at the Coburn Center for the Humanities at Brown University. Since October 2013, she is finally fellow at the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture. In 2013, Dr. Kassab received, and this is really a point to not to forget and unforgettable, the most renowned Sheikh Zayed Book Award for the Arabic version of her book Contemporary Arab Thought, Cultural Critique in Comparative Perspective. This is not an invention, this is not an imagination, it is a book reality. You have read the abstract, but please allow me to formulate some questions that provoked me when thinking about the role of intellectuals in the process of the formerly so-called Arab Spring up to now. In the center, we had the chance to discuss with some of those prominent figures, Sadiq Al-Azm, Hamadi Redisi, both fellows, and Fatima Mernissi was a visiting professor at the University of Bonn some years ago. Thereby, the Department of Islamic Studies at the University of Bonn and her wonderful co-player Annemarie Schimmel were always at the forefront of bringing people from the Arabic world closer to a German public, as well as our senior fellow Stefan Witt. But why is it such a challenge to talk about the role of the intellectuals in the Arab world? Is there any specific problematic due to historical, cultural, or political circumstances of the Arab thoughts in plurality? What is the role of intellectuals in the Arab revolts after all the years of a critique of authoritarian systems? The intellectuals were not at the forefront of the revolts. In a way, they were reduced to commenting the events instead of leading them as the intellectual self-empowerment generally demands. Is there even a failure in predicting, in analyzing revolutionary moments, in understanding a society? What is the gap between the typical locations of intellectuals on the one hand, that is the study room for studying Arab thought and poetry on the one hand, and the real bearers of the upheavals in the mythic space of the Arab street on the other hand? Is there an estrangement or alienation between the intellectual conception of the world and social realities? Why were intellectuals more or less distant to the outcry of freedom, justice, and dignity? And what are the consequences for a future in which the battle between religiously inspired or referred to interpretations of the world compete with secular ones, a camp in which intellectuals of the Western type were mostly situated? And what kind of secularism after the breakdown of the Iron Curtain and therewith of the left and of Marxism? Therefore, to my understanding, a reading of Weber's non-Marxian and liberal critique of modernism in the Arab world was so important and could have been even more if and when the translation would have been made feasible, as Tahar Labib was planning, at least. So far, the Arab side. The tonality of the intellectual claim for a better world is linked with Zola's famous speech act, J'accuse. It shows how much the rise and growth of the champ intellectuel is linked with the juristic profession. No great revolution without legal theorizing in the same time. Last week, Carol Berger reminded us of Marx's manifesto and the jurist's dream of a society without the law. Is it possible that the role of law, lawyers, and the legal personnel in Arabo-Islamic traditions is so much linked with religion as the double role of the ulama suggests, what makes for some peculiarities in doing revolution in these societies? Let me stop here with my long questionary. It is always easy to ask questions. To give answers is somehow more delicate. And that is why we finally should listen to the specialist we are so proud of, having the luck to host her for a while in the nomadic life that the intellectual plays in the global age. Thank you very much for being with us. I take my... Okay. Me?
Thank you, Professor Gebhardt. I think I speak in the name of all my fellows here When I say confidently and gratefully that this place, the Käte Hamburger Kolleg, Recht als Kultur, is a place to be wunschlos glücklich. What we enjoy here is utter luxury. The competent and friendly support we receive on all levels is unique, and the whole setup is made to nurture creativity in an atmosphere of freedom and intellectual rigor. And so I sincerely thank Professor Stefan Wild for having recommended me to the Kolleg, and to thank Professor Werner Gebhardt to have welcomed me to it with his warm hospitality. I also want to thank Dr. Finger and the whole team for being so kind and so helpful all the time. But I need to mention another contributor to my bliss here, and that's your majestic river. You have no idea what role it plays in soothing my soul and helping me think through some of the more troubling parts of our world. I know you have already heard me speak about this Rhinish effect on me during my stay here. But it was very interesting for me to hear my newly arrived colleague from Tunisia, Professor Amel Grami, talk about the same effect when we had our first chat last week. Your river seems to have a special effect on those of us hailing from the Arab world. Perhaps you have to have your eyes and your minds filled with I'll skip this. I thought you should have a program called Curative Rhine for Troubled Arab Minds. Now, contemplating the Rhine and thinking of my talk today, I wondered what general concept could serve as an overall headline for my presentation. And I was actually looking backwards, say, for the last 20, 25 years of my work on Arab thinkers. And the work that I've been doing after the revolution, reading these Arab intellectuals, discussing and debating basically stuff on culture, I thought that one headline would be the dream of sovereignty. So I'm going to speak a little bit about this broad headline, then I'm going to say a few things about Arab intellectuals, and then focus on these two Egyptian intellectuals, Khaled, Fahmy, and Hoda Elsadda. Now, what do I mean by the dream of sovereignty? Also, having read the Arab debates and in conjunction with African and Latin American debates, I have a sense, this is my impression, that what all of these people are so troubled with, are trying to understand, trying to make sense of, is really this quest for sovereignty. And I'm going to qualify here the term dream. Dream not so much in the sense of, you know, an extra thing, you know that it's unreachable, but you would like to have it. Not dream in that sense. Dream in the sense of a deep quest. And I think it comes from the time of the struggle against colonialism, that you would like to be sovereign. You want to be governed by yourself. You want to organize your own wealth and so on. Now, this dream that we can also call the dream of the nation state is the dream, on the one hand, of a state that you don't have the French or the British or the Americans running your country, but your own people, and the state doing a good job ensuring prosperity, equality, all of these things. And nation, well, people coming together and forming some kind of a political wills around some kind of a common good. Well, you know that none of this was realized in any of in much of the third world. So neither the dream of sovereignty in the sense of complete freedom or complete independence was ensured, because of neo-colonialism, because of the entanglement, because of you come too late into a structure of power that is already beyond your control, but also because you ended up producing states that possess the tools of power, police, they have the weapons, they have the connections, they have the money, and this state turned into a horrible apparatus, a formidable apparatus of repression, of corruption, of theft, of mismanagement, and of violence against you, of censorship. And the people, on the other hand, could not come together to form a political will. And I think all the agony of the last, say, 50 or 60 years turns around this effort, this effort to become sovereign also as people, in the sense of the holder, the organizer of the public affairs. Now, the French have this wonderful word for such a people, le souverain. And when they read the news bulletin, sometimes instead of saying the people, they say le souverain decided this and that, and always sort of clicks in my ears as, yeah, that's what it should be. And much of this agony and of the malaise took a cultural turn. In other words, well, we didn't manage to have a good state because we don't have a healthy culture, there is something wrong with our culture, and if we have a problem being a united people, it's because, you know, we haven't agreed on our identity. All this obsession with identity and cultural tradition and what have you. As I read these intellectuals discussing all of this over, say, the last 40 years, I noticed that for many of the critical thinkers, the conclusion was, having thought about these matters, their conclusion was that in reality the problem is not cultural, it is political. That, for instance, if people haven't managed to become a unified political power, it's because the states have manipulated the differences, the culture, the religious, the ethnic, the regional, the linguistic. I mean, think of Saddam Hussein, of Bashar al-Assad, of Libya, I mean, it's not so natural that these people never came together to form a dream, that dream of sovereignty. So I think that what we witnessed since independence, in fact, this is my theory, is a deferral of the dream of sovereignty. Now, as I was contemplating all of this and looking at the Rhine, a little poem came from the back of my mind. I had read it, I'm sure it's familiar to some of you. I had read it a while ago and suddenly it came back, and here it is. It is a poem by Langston Hughes. Here he is. He is one of the leaders, he has been one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance. And this is the cultural movement that the Black Americans witnessed in the 20s and the 30s, based in Harlem. Harlem was the other title he gave to this poem. And the dream or the quest or the agony was precisely to reach some dignities, a dignified life. And so the poem reads, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Now, this poem had a fantastic destiny. It became very, very famous, and one line of it was taken by this beautiful young lady, Lorraine Hansberry, who produced a play called A Raisin in the Sun. Now, this play was written in 1959, and it was inspired by Lorraine's own family experience of segregation in Chicago. It was a Supreme Court case, Hansberry versus Lee, regarding a house, and the play turns around the right to keep a house in the wrong side of the city, namely the white side. And the play was made into a film in 1961, starring Sidney Poitier. Then it was made into a musical in 1973, then in a TV film in 1989, then again in 2008. It went on Broadway in 1959, then again in 2004, and now it is playing again on Broadway. So this business, this struggle of a quest of a dignified life, that is an obvious thing for every one of us, and that is not made that obvious, seems to go through these phases. What happens when this dream is not realized or is severely hindered in its realization? Langston Hughes died, he was buried in Harlem. This is the Schomburg Center. It is a branch of the New York Public Library in Harlem. And he lies under the lobby of the center, which represents rivers again, as you see. And it is inspired by a poem he wrote when he was only 18 about rivers. This is the poem. Now, I'm a bit surprised that Hughes didn't include the Amazon, because I think that the Black experience really had an important chapter of its dramatic journey also in Southern America. Now, I don't know about my soul, but I can tell you about my research that it benefited a lot from wandering around all of these rivers. And as I said, I think in Arab studies, the danger and the temptation of being encapsulated in some kind of an autistic, self-referential system seems to be very big. And for me, it was very liberating, really, to read also other debates in Latin America and in Africa around these issues of cultural malaise and cultural critique and cultural authenticity and the political currents of all of that debate. And recently, it is this Jamaican anthropologist, professor at Columbia. His work has become very, very interesting for me. He comes from Jamaica, and his work is on Caribbean debates and Caribbean intellectual history. And his main topic is really the aftermath of sovereignty. What happened in the Caribbean when these countries became independent? And what he does really is to look at the narratives and how the narratives really change or not change as the years go by, as we move from the dreams of sovereignty to the disenchantment of the post-independence era. And his book, for instance, his reading of the liberation of Toussaint Louverture, Conscripts of Modernity, the Tragedy of Colonial Enlightenment, resonates perfectly with me regarding the question of what happens to liberation and critique once we have these states we end up having. Now, going back, can I go back to, well, no, you know the poem by now. In fact, I think that when I finished this book at the eve of the revolution, it came out in 2010. My sense was that the dream of sovereignty of the Arabs had become a heavy log. Really, that sense that, khalas, it's a deep exhaustion, and I always say in my talks about this that the word I encountered most in the Arab writings, in the interviews, in the books, in the articles, it was the notion of ajz, total incapacitation, helplessness, despair. That really, that sense that you cannot change anything about anything. And suddenly it explodes. This is why I think Hughes's poem came to my mind. And I started following up the comments of the reactions of intellectuals to these revolutions. And I noticed many things that we could talk about later on, about the generational demarcation, how suddenly you have older people who react in a certain way, younger intellectuals who become prominent, still very, very young people who become very active. But I thought I would like to focus today on a certain type of intellectuals. These are people who are in their 50s, more or less. They are university people, and most of them have had training in the West, but they live in their own countries, and they have become public intellectuals in the sense that they participate in the public debate. They write in the newspapers, in the magazines, on the internet, on Facebook. They are very active. They are also politically involved, and they write at least in two languages. They write in Arabic. They also write in English. They talk to their own people, and they talk to foreigners holding the same discourse. I want to present to you some of their pictures to demonstrate to you that they are real people I'm talking about. This is Mona Fayyad. I start with the Lebanese. She is a sociologist, retired from the Lebanese University now. She comes from a Shia background, and she is one of the most outspoken and one of the most courageous critics of Hezbollah. And you have to have courage to do it. And as Hezbollah was achieving its divine victories in 2006 by provoking yet another devastating war on Lebanon, Mona Fayyad wrote an article in Al-Nahar which became very, very famous, asking the question, معنى أن تكون شيعيا اليوم? What does it mean to be Shiite today? And one of the particularities of these people is that they remain consistent. It's not that one day they say something and then they disappear and then they are co-opted and they suddenly become very nice to their opponents. This is Yassin al-Hajj Saleh, called the Hakim of the Syrian revolution. He's Syrian because he's a medical doctor, but also Hakim in Arabic means wise. Yassin spent 17 years in the Assad jails. He was arrested when he was barely 19 for his sympathies with the Communist Party. He survived, and when he came out of jail, he finished his studies in medicine but was prevented from practicing, so he became a public intellectual. Yassin writes, for the last 15 years has been writing. I think he's one of the most brilliant Arab minds. And if anybody can do something about nominating him for the Ibn Rushd Prize that is given in Berlin, I think he thoroughly deserves it. Now he is hiding in Istanbul because his wife was kidnapped in December by the Islamists in Damascus. His brother is also kidnapped by the Islamists in northern Syria, and the man continues to work and think. I don't know how a human being can manage that. This is our own colleague, Amel Grami, and I think we will have the opportunity to hear her in the coming weeks. But I thought that also her journey addressing and engaging and opposing the Islamists in a place like Tunisia, where Islamists are not high school kids, requires a whole lot of, again, consistency, moral courage, moral integrity at the price of huge risks. These are the people I'm talking about. Now I will move to Egyptians, because this will be the focus of my talk. Sharif Younis is a historian. He has studied in Egypt, and he is professor at Cairo University in Helwan. His main work is on the Nasrid period, and sort of trying to understand why people reacted the way they did towards Nasser, and also a deconstruction of the whole myth and the whole ideology of the Nasser era. Reem Saad, anthropologist at the American University of Cairo, very outspoken, writes in Al-Shuruq against capital punishment and involved in all sorts of NGOs. Azzeddin Shukri is a former diplomat, Egyptian diplomat, now also having studied political science in Canada. He wrote this fascinating book, Bab al-Khuruj, Exit, right at the beginning of the revolution, sort of making pretending that somebody is writing to his son in 2020 about what happened. So it's some kind of a travel in time and his fictionary imagination of what this whole revolution will be leading to. Rabab al-Mahdi, political science, American University of Cairo, very outspoken in defense of the revolution. Khaled Fahmy, I'll be focusing on him in a moment. And Hoda Sadda. Khaled is a historian, Hoda Sadda is in English literature and comparative literature. Okay, let me speak a little bit about Khaled Fahmy. So I'll divide the remaining of my time between Khaled Fahmy and Hoda Sadda. Khaled Fahmy, way before the revolution started, in the 90s, wrote his dissertation at Oxford University on the army of Muhammad Ali. Now, this army in Egypt, the army is considered to be the pillar of the state and the pillar of the modern Egyptian state. And it has a whole aura to it that it is really the most patriotic institution and so on. This is the patriotic narrative. What Khaled did was to look at the people's history, a social history from the bottom, if you like, and to go into the archives and see what information they deliver about the way these people were conscripted into the army, how this army came into being to start with. And it produced his famous book, All the Pasha's Men. Muhammad Ali Pasha, his army, and the founding of modern Egypt. It was translated into Arabic by Sharif Younis. And so his version of this glorious story of the Egyptian army is not glorious at all. That these people, the peasants, resisted ferociously the conscription because it was a terrible form of enslavement, that some people put rat poison into their eyes or cut their fingers to avoid conscription, that the peasants rose up against Muhammad Ali across Egypt from the north to the south, resisting and refusing this conscription. So the whole idea that, and of course Muhammad Pasha, Ali Pasha was a governor, an Ottoman governor of Egypt, who did not speak Arabic, who was not at all interested in the Egyptians, who came from Kavalov, was an Albanian, and his concern was to build an army with which he could secure for himself maximum autonomy from the Ottoman Empire. So already there, we see this alienating institution, an institution that is against the people, and that is based on violence, that is based on the total denigration of the people. And so what he does is to debunk this patriotic narrative about the army. And this is not an ideological discourse that he presents, but this is archival work. And as I said, all of this was done way before the revolution started. He became professor, a tenured professor at NYU. And just before the revolution, for some reason, this is interesting, he decides to come back to Egypt, and he becomes professor and chair of the history department of the American University of Cairo. And he becomes very much involved in the revolution, sympathizing with it, and as I will say now, involved in many of the activities, including the legal reforms. Another interest of Khaled Fahmy was to look at the history of law and medicine, especially forensic medicine, to look at how courts were operating in the late 19th century. Again, to see exactly how this modern Egypt, the modern legal system and the modern medical school developed in Egypt. And there he uses, again, archival material to show that in matters of law there was a lot of creative bringing together of different schools of law or traditions of law. On the one hand, the Sharia, but also modern, secular, Western schools. The same thing for medicine. Now, the School of Medicine was again created by the Pasha, not in order to serve the well-being and the health of the Egyptians, but to preserve the army, to stop diseases, to prevent his soldiers from dying. And so he calls on French doctors who come and establish the School of Medicine. And Khaled Fahmy writes the history of this, the development of this medical school. Now, this is his scholarly work, if you want. Very well established, as I said, tenured at NYU, prominent in his field. He comes back to Egypt and he becomes very quickly a public intellectual. He gives interviews, and from the very consistently up till now, interviews with NPR, CNN, BBC, writing both and also on Egyptian television and radio programs, flagship programs, mainstream, revolutionary, new and old, like Al-Shuruq, Ahram Online, Ahram Weekly, Al-Akhbar, Akhbar Al-Adab, Al-Fanar. And what is interesting that for a couple of years, between I think 2011, 2012, his articles, one of his articles would appear in Al-Shuruq in Arabic, and in 2 days later it would appear in Ahram Online in English. So this is a man who is eloquent, who speaks very softly and quietly, who speaks very rationally, presents argument against arguments, and who engages on a regular basis, picking up on particular events, particular deaths, particular demonstrations. And this is very different from the older generation kind of supposedly enlightened intellectual, like, say, Gaber Asfour or Murad Wahbi, these gentlemen of enlightenment in Egypt who thought that, well, they have the misfortune to be among this retarded people of theirs, and so in order to enlighten them, they would write this wonderful treatise once and for all against for tolerance, against obscurantism. Of course, that reaches no one and interests no one. This is a very different kind of public intellectual. It is not pontificating, it is not paternalizing, it is not preaching, let me now give you a summary of John Locke and you will know what to do tomorrow. It's, as I said, taking particular events, particular incidents, and bringing his expertise. So when, for instance, Khaled Fahmy speaks about the state of archives, he knows what he's talking about. And there was a point where an Islamist was appointed, again by the name of Khaled Fahmy, to be the head of the archives, the National Archives. And there was a whole halubaloo, of course, from the opponent saying, my God, he's going to purge the archives, get rid of anything that is not Islamist friendly, and so on. And Khaled's point was that, in fact, the problem with the archives and most of the cultural institutions in the country is that they are people unfriendly. So he has all sorts of anecdotes of him going to the National Archives or to the library asking for a book or a document, and he has to have a security clearance every time he wants to read, say, a 19th century medical school document. And so consistently you would find him every now and then, this is one of the themes he carries with him, about access to information. For 2 years, he was a member of the committee involved in drafting the bill of information, supposedly to have a free access, the securing the right of Egyptians to have free access to information. After serving 2 years on the committee, of course, nothing happened, and he sadly declared that none of the input, none of the recommendations that the committee, which was a civil society committee, had made towards this draft were taken into consideration. But this is what I would like to point out. This connection between the man's expertise, now being an archives guy, somebody, a historian, his ability or his readiness to use this in a legal reform effort. Now, most of those efforts up till now have been fruitless because of the circumstances. Another topic is the army. He says that during the early revolutions, one of the chants was "Sha'b wal-jaysh id wahda," the people and the army one hand. And he says this is one of the slogans he couldn't bring himself to chant, knowing what this army was. And not only because its foundations were really against the people, and at no point did the army have any social contract with the people, but also because under Mubarak, the army had become such a hugely powerful corruption institution that there was no way he could identify himself and could hope that this institution could stand by him. As some of you might know, apparently the Egyptian army possesses or runs 40%, 30% of the economy. The army officers have hotels, water bottling firms in which they employ soldiers, conscripts, for free, in which they use public lands, public factories, and so on. And there is a total taboo over the army budget. And one of the main struggles of the revolutionaries, in fact, was to require a civil supervision over the army budget, and they failed. Of course, we're not surprised that the army saw to it that its budget remains secret because it's national security secret, that the defense minister will always be somebody from the army. People, the revolutionaries, did not want that. They wanted a civilian as a defense minister. And Khaled Fahmy was among the most eloquent spokesmen in this matter against public punishment, also against the military trial of civilians. This was again one of the main demands of the revolutionaries, because the army was very happy to draw on people, arrest them, kill them, torture them in the name of, martial courts, that this was high security, as an enemy of security and what have you. So revolutionaries were struggling and insisting against military trials of civilians. The new constitution has it all nicely, and the very last line apparently in that paragraph says that yes, no civilian is to be tried in a military court except when it comes to national security. And who decides that? Torture is a big topic for Khaled Fahmy already in his scholarship. He's been looking at the development of the police already in the 19th century. Like in other places, I suppose, torture was the official way of punishing, the punitive method, and the way to extract information. In 1861, says Khaled Fahmy, there was a decision to stop torture and use instead life imprisonment because of consideration of equality, that people of different statures bear torture differently, and that because forensic medicine had become developed enough to have recourse to other things than just torturing people and forcing them to confess what they wanted them to confess. So torture is another important theme, and Khaled keeps on reminding his readers that the revolution, 25th of January, is the police day in Egypt, and that the demonstrations which were called on that day were in protestation against the police brutality against Khaled Said, this one extra death that pushed people to go to take to the streets. And so he keeps reminding people that it is no coincidence that the revolution exploded on the police day, requiring then a reform of the internal security body, which never took place and which will not take place so far. Now, I'm going to let him speak to you for 4 minutes. This is an interview, his answer to the claim at the height of the Islamist rule last year. One of the arguments was to say, we want to go back to Sharia. No, this is a widespread argument in the Arab world, that this system is corrupt. We want our authentic justice system. So this is Khaled at work. So what I wanted, in fact, to underline here in his case is this connection between somebody's scholarship and his moral and political stand, and his involvement on a regular basis. Okay, now a few words on Hoda Sadda. Hoda also came back to Egypt just before the revolution, in 2011 actually. Between 2005 and 2011, she was Director of Arabic Studies at Manchester. And Hoda is a prominent figure in Middle Eastern studies, especially in women's studies. She studied in Egypt at Cairo University and at the American University of Cairo, English literature. She is today, since she's back in Egypt, she's professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. And I'm not going to read you all of the scholarly institutions she's involved in. She's really a prominent scholar in her field. But like Khaled, way before the revolution started, in the early 90s, she started this is her latest book, Gender, Nation, and the Arabic Novel. She started a journal called Hagar, devoted to gender issues in the Arab world. Then, another important thing was her co-founding of this NGO called Women and Memory Forum in Egypt in '96, together with other scholars, and she's now the chair of this NGO. The purpose of all her scholarship, in fact, what her core interest is, to revise, a bit like Khaled Fahmy, to revisit this story, the social and cultural history of modern Egypt. And in her cases, her interest was to dig out all of the women voices which were left out, which were ignored, which were silenced, by republishing their work, by shedding light on them, especially the Nahda period, late 19th century, very important Arab modernization movement. She wanted to revive some of these women's voices. Also, what the NGO does is to translate feminist literature, to organize workshops for MA students, for PhD students, and to sort of disseminate, to raise awareness about gender issues. She was involved, again, way before the revolution, in the family law reform. And one of the things she raises in her interviews lately is how those reforms, which were done under Mubarak, a little bit to improve, if you want, the divorce rights for women, are now dubbed, especially by the Islamists, to be Mubarak's laws, and more particularly his wife, Suzanne's laws. And so discrediting those reforms on the basis of them being associated with this corrupt dictator. And she says that not only the Islamists, but also all the conservative forces, even in the so-called liberal parties, have attacked those reforms in the name of cultural authenticity. You wouldn't be surprised. She was appointed rapporteur of the Committee on Rights and Freedoms in the Assembly of the 50, which was appointed to redraft the Constitution. So at the end of 2013, there was a second effort to draft a new constitution for Egypt, and she was one of those 50s. And on numerous occasions, she explains her position, on the one hand, of course, being skeptical of really what can be achieved given the power constellation on the ground, the fact that the militaries are in power, or the Islamists still very much in power. So on the one hand, her being skeptical, but at the same time trying to impact as much as possible, to defend, to push rights as much as possible, especially in questions of family law, discrimination against women, to criminalize discrimination, to criminalize violence against women, harassment, sexual harassment, which was used as a political tool against the revolution. She has joined the Democratic Socialist Party after the revolution. She is on the board of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. And so again, the kind of profile that this woman presents for me is precisely this type of intellectuals who, as I said, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, but sort of making a final point here, people who are using their academic, scholarly expertise, their knowledge of the history, their actual work on specific topics, and their old struggle on these matters to bring them to bear on the transformations that are taking place. Now, none of these efforts have been successful so far because of the conditions and the circumstances, and things will get worse in the coming times. But these are people who consistently, courageously, and with a great deal of integrity, respecting their addressees, which is again, I'll come back to it, will sort of defend these causes against torture, against the abuses of the army, against discrimination. Very different from the kind of discourse, once again, the old gentleman had, sort of course, despising the people they're talking to. They're not even talking to them, actually. The concern of the older generation was to attack the opponents, like attack your Islamist man on across the table. They didn't really bother to talk to any of the people they were supposed to be defending. So this generation of intellectuals is, I think, a new one, a very interesting one, and worth following on. So this is what I wanted to do with you. Thank you. Here they are, to prove that they are real and they are there.